1 Timothy 4:12. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity.
Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
I just want to say that I'm a little bit amazed. Do you know for how long I have been trying to get Haley Nam to pray, and she did a wonderful job this morning. She doesn't know it, but she's probably going to get to do that again. I am really, really proud of our students. I really am. Every week we meet in that conference room, and whenever I propose the idea that was proposed to me about a student Sunday, there was a little bit of, oh, you don't want us to get in front of everyone, do you? Yes, I did, and I think that they've done a wonderful job. But, you know, if you come to the English service, our students do everything anyway. You think about it, Haram is always playing the piano, Haley is always playing the drums, Andrew is always doing the sound. We do a student Sunday every Sunday. So, but I just want everyone to know that I am proud of these young people. Can you show them your appreciation this morning in a round of applause? And I would like to include Wanjong, but I don't know that Wanjong is necessarily a student when you're knocking on the door of a PhD. I mean, so this morning, I do want to talk to you about the subject of young hearts, big faith. Young hearts, big faith. And I want you to imagine as we start out this morning, being David in the valley, standing just a few yards away from this monstrous giant named Goliath. David is standing there looking in the eyes of this beast of a man. And the ironic thing is that standing behind David, 100 yards or more, was the army. David was the only one in the battlefield, though. It was a young boy that stood out there. Now, these men that stood behind David, they were more specialized in their training. They had been through more exercises. They had more tactical experience in the way of warfare. And for David, it seemed like age and experience was stacked against him because it was a young man's faith that won the battle that day. It wasn't the person who had more experience. It wasn't the more aged person. When you think about it, standing behind David, those were where the mercenaries were. Those were the people that were highly skilled in weapons. If anyone should have been on that battlefield looking at that giant, it should have been one of those people, not young David. But it was a young heart and big faith that got the job done that day. Today, we're going to look at a very similar experience. You look at Timothy and the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul looks at his number one guy, Timothy. And he says, don't let anyone think less of you because you are young, but be an example. And that word example is the Greek word typos. It's the word that you think of whenever they stamp out a coin. They put the die on there and they hit it with the hammer and it leaves the image of the coin on there. Or that's a stamp or a pattern or a print. Or I've got some friends that they make leather billfolds, wallets, purses, things like that. And they will, have you ever been to somewhere on vacation and they're making a belt and they put your name on the belt and they will stamp it? That's what we're looking at here. The Apostle Paul looks at Timothy and he says, I want you to be the pattern that is embedded, the example in what you say, how you live, how you love, your faith, and in purity. So the first thing that I would like to tell you young people, and today's I'm primarily going to be preaching to young people, but the rest of you, I hope you grab onto some of the things that I'm saying too. Young people, listen to me. Remove the label that has been attached to you. Remove the label. I don't know if you've ever taken the label off something. If you get a new mattress, there is a label on there that says, do not remove this label, except you may be punished by federal law. I don't know of anybody that's ever went to prison for taking a label off of a mattress. But sometimes you might buy a shirt and the tag, the label, just really irritates you. And you pull that label off. That tag says that the shirt, in my case, is a 3X. I got more reaction out of telling you my shirt size than I've got for a year and a half of preaching. But sometimes that tag just wears on you and you have to remove the label. Or whenever I grew up without a whole lot of stuff. We were not well off. We didn't have a lot of money, but my clothes and my blue jeans particularly were blue jeans that didn't cost a whole lot. They were what we call generic, okay? And I was embarrassed because of the tag, because of the label that was on my pants. So I would take the label off, and you really wouldn't know by looking at my pants what type of pants they were. Well, what I'm going to tell you this morning, young people, is take the label off that's been attached to you. You know, whenever I look around, there are so many different things that were labeled one way, but have been used in different ways. And the first thing that I thought of this week was a yo-yo. You ever seen the yo-yo? It's the toy. It wasn't a toy. It was created to be a weapon. But some child saw it, or some person saw it and thought, that would be a great toy. So now, a yo-yo, it's not a weapon, it's a toy. Or in my house, I don't know about your house, you know, you go to the hardware store and you buy paint, and you get a paint stirring stick. In my house, that's a paddle for my children. It's supposed to be used to mix the paint, but we use it to fix attitudes in our house. Or a back scratcher. Or how many of you have ever used a wire coat hanger for some reason other than hanging clothes? Yeah. Open the car. In my business, we have to run wire in a wall. And we use coat hangers to reach in the wall and grab the wire and pull it out all the time. Or maybe a piece of pipe. Maybe it's plastic pipe, maybe it's metal pipe. Do you know how many times I have used a piece of pipe and put it on the end of a wrench to get more force on the wrench, to get more leverage? Or I've seen my grandmother or my mother take a piece of pipe and stand it in the dirt next to their tomato plants to help the tomato plants to grow straight. All of these things have labels on them. But we often remove the labels. You see, the world will tell young people, Olivia, the world is going to tell you that you are inexperienced. But Paul tells Timothy, don't let that stop you. Don't let your inexperience. And I want you to understand this morning that God has given you a greater purpose than what people look at you and often see. God has poured his very best out upon you. Now, the context of this whole portion of Scripture that we're looking at this morning is you've got the Apostle Paul, who was probably in his 70s. And we read this Scripture and we think of Timothy as a young man. He was actually probably about 30 years old. The Apostle Paul, he looks at Timothy and he calls him a youth. And in the Greek, in the Greek system, in the Greek world, a youth was anyone that was under 40 years old, because that was military age. Your 40th year was, you could be in the military up until you were about 40 years old. So here's something that I want you to understand. Understand that regardless of your label, you are never too young to be used of God. You see, Timothy was entrusted in leading this large church in Ephesus. And whenever you look at Timothy, his age was not the qualifier that got him there. It was Timothy's character. It was the way that Timothy acted. It was the commitment that Timothy had made to the gospel that was the qualifying thing that got him set up as the pastor. Wisdom isn't limited to just those with gray hair. Wisdom is not limited just to the older generation. Proverbs tells us in Proverbs chapter 20 that even a child makes himself known by his acts, whether his conduct is pure and upright. Wisdom comes in so many forms. When you look at the story of King Solomon, anybody ever heard of King Solomon? King Solomon, they said that he was one of the wisest kings, the wisest people that ever lived. And King Solomon was anointed as king at 20 years old. And whenever King Solomon was anointed as king, he went to God and he didn't ask for riches. He didn't ask for the things that most politicians want. What he does is he goes to God and he says, God, I beg of you, wisdom. Give me wisdom. Have you ever seen a politician that didn't want riches? It wasn't riches, though. It was wisdom that he desired. And Solomon, he had this burning desire to lead the nation righteously. To lead them righteously, and that was an asset to the kingdom. Well, then you look in the New Testament, and there is this book called James. In James chapter 1 and verse 5, it says this. It says, if any of you, now does that say just you older saints? It says, if any of you, that doesn't say just you with gray hair, just you that have a developed resume. It says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all, young and old alike, people that have experience, people that do not have experience. God gives wisdom to all without finding fault. Ask and it will be given to you. Well, back to 1 Timothy. There were 5 areas that Paul instructs Timothy to be an example in. So I want to look at each one of them for just a minute. And I'm going to quiz you younger people later on. Anybody want to take a test? Speech. First thing that Paul tells Timothy is he says, be an example in speech. This doesn't mean to go and stand up in front of some crowd and give a speech. This means our everyday language. We need to set an example in the way that we talk. You see, our tongues are a very, very slippery place. This little muscle inside of our mouth here, it can get us into so much trouble. It can create so much trouble that we can't even fathom. How many careers have been ended because of this tongue? How many friendships have been lost because of this tongue? And we think to ourselves, oh, it's just words. Words don't really matter. Well, I want to go back to James again. In James chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, it says this. It says, we all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. When we put bits into mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole horse, the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is small. It's a small part of the body, but it makes great boast. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course on one's life on fire, and it itself set on fire by hell. You see, James, he knows the power of the tongue. He knows the trouble that can be created by your words. He says, my tongue can be something that is an out-of-control fire. And Paul writes to Timothy and he says, Timothy, your words carry a great weight in setting the example for the gospel. Young people, teenagers, kids, old people, realize that your tongue can either do great damage or it can do great things for the Lord. What we say matters so much. And then Paul moves on. He says, and in conduct, or the way that you live your life, our lives have to be examples in our conduct. We should be like little Jesuses running all over the place with our behavior and our conduct. When people look at us, they should see his love. When they look at us, they should see his compassion. When they look at us, they should see his joy. They should see his integrity. Everything that he embodied, everything that he was like, we should be like. And Paul tells Timothy, he says, I want you to silence the critics that will come at you through your conduct, through the way that you act. Now, this doesn't mean to ignore criticism. A lot of times we like to just ignore things and hope that they go away. That's not what the Apostle Paul was telling Timothy. He says, I want you to live in a way that when criticism comes your way, that the way that you live lets everyone know that that charge is a hollow charge. The way that you live is going to be your testimony that makes the accusation not true. There is a Bible commentator by the name of William Barclay, and he was writing one time about a time that Plato was accused of some sort of type of indiscretion in his behavior, in the way he lived. And Plato said, well, we must live in such a way that all men will see that this charge is false. And what I want to tell you this morning, young people, is that our actions speak louder than words. Verbal defenses, they're probably not going to silence criticism, but Christ-like conduct will. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be charges and there won't be accusations, and that isn't that it's easy. It's not easy to walk through somebody accusing you of something, but let your conduct prove them wrong. I had a friend when I lived in Missouri. She was the one that coordinated all of the worship at our church, the worship singers, the music list, the musicians that were going to play. And at our church, we had, has anyone in here ever heard of a ministry called Teen Challenge? Anyone? Okay. Teen Challenge is a ministry where people with addiction issues go to, and they'll spend 9 to 13 months, and they come out on fire for the Lord. And we had about 60 men that would come from the local Teen Challenge Center and come to our evening worship service on Sundays. Well, in the summertime, it gets very hot. And Sister Vicky, every once in a while, she would catch one of the young ladies trying to get on the platform to sing in something very revealing, something that showed a little bit too much skin. And so Sister Vicky would put a choir robe on the woman, you know, so that, and she would tell them, she would say, these men are away from their families. They're away from their significant other for a long period of time. Why would you want to get on the platform and be a stumbling block for one of those men? And this is the reason I brought Sister Vicky up, is she looked at our team and she said something that has stayed with me. She said, while others may, you may not. In other words, other people can get away with it. But for you, you're held to a higher standard. While others may, you may not. And I've always kept that in my heart. And sometimes my kids even will say, well, why can't we? Because everybody else, all of our other friends are able. And I'll say, while others may, you may not. Young people, listen to me. God has his hand upon your life. God is doing something in you that you cannot even fathom. You can't understand what God is doing in your life at this point. And there's going to be times that you're going to run up against something and you're going to want to do it because everyone is doing it. But just realize that other people can, but you can't, because you've got a higher calling upon your life. You've got something that is valuable, something precious that the Lord has given you, and you don't want to spoil that. And then Paul looks at Timothy and he tells Timothy, he says, I want you to be an example in love. Now, full honesty, Pastor Paul stopped at the donut shop this morning. I like donuts. You can tell by looking at me, right? I like donuts. Whenever the Apostle Paul tells Timothy in love, this isn't something like, I love donuts, or I love pizza, or I love baseball. He's talking about the greatest virtue alive here. We know that in 1 Corinthians, which is chapter 13, we call the love chapter. And the Apostle Paul, he writes in 1 Corinthians, he says, without love, all of your gifts, all of your talents, all of your abilities, everything that you possess is worthless. It's worthless if you don't embody love. It says if I can speak with tongues of men and angels, if I can do great things, and I do all of these things, if I burn my body, if I give my possessions away, if I do all of that, but yet I don't have love, I'm just a clanging gong. I'm a ringing cymbal. Everything is useless. But what you've got to know, whenever you read this, whenever you read the New Testament, there are 4 types of love whenever you read the New Testament. So whenever Paul writes to Timothy and he says, you need to be an example in love. Which love is it? You've got to know. So I want to run through those 4 types of love. First off, there's the love that is what we call eros, erotic. It's the love that husbands and wives share. Well, that's not what the Apostle Paul is talking to Timothy about. Then there's phileo, brotherly love. It's the love that I have for Sonny. It's the love that I have for Sebastian. You may have gone to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania before. The city of brotherly love. It's because the root word there is phileo, love, brotherly love. That's not what the Apostle Paul is talking about there. Then you've got storge love. Storge love is interesting. I bet whenever Ezra was born back here, that whenever Hannah looked at him, she automatically loved Ezra. Whenever your children were born, you looked at your children and there was automatically a bond, a connection that you can't explain. It's not something that you build up. It's just automatic and natural. That's storge love. It's the love of a parent to a child. That's not what the Apostle Paul writes. Then there's this other word called agapao. It's the Greek word agapao, and that is where we get our word agape. It's the agape love. And agape love, it's a sacrificial love. It's a love that gives out of inconvenience. It's a love that gives and doesn't expect anything in return. That is what the Apostle Paul says to Timothy. I want you to be an example in love that gives and gives and gives and gives. Don't expect anything in return. This was agape love that Paul called Timothy to. Young people, we have to be people of love. And then he says, and in faith, and I need to move along quickly here. In James chapter 2 and verse 7, you've probably heard this, where James, he says, faith without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. You can't have faith stored up and do nothing with it. If you have faith, it's going to be required that you do something. It's not a storehouse that you collect faith and then use it. I'm going to build up my faith. No, you have faith and you use your faith. And then you get more faith when you use your faith. And I don't mean like TV preacher here. I'm not going there, okay? But let your actions be vibrant expressions of the inner fire that God has inside of you. We should burn brightly. What I'd like to tell you is that age really is irrelevant whenever you're coming to being children of the kingdom of God. Passion for Jesus has no limit. Passion for Jesus doesn't care about age. So whether you're young and eager, or you're sitting here this morning and you've got some miles on the car, you're more seasoned. Whether you're young and eager or seasoned in your faith, let the enthusiasm for God ignite those around you. We should lead by example. We're called to be that, I don't want to use a buzzword, but a beacon of faith for those around us. Remember, the Apostle Paul says example, and that is the typos, the pattern, the die. We are to be that example of faith. And one thing I'd like to tell you about faith is that faith is not just for sunny days. It's not just for sunny days. Faith is an anchor for the storms. Have you ever been out on the water and it gets really, really rough? You have to anchor up. That's faith. See, true faith, it's not fleeting. It's not a feeling. True faith is consistency. True faith is commitment. True faith is a dedication in our life every day in our actions. And if you really wanted to dive deep into that word that Paul uses there, whenever you look, it's actually a word that looks more like faithfulness on your part. It's the consistency in our life. And then he says we must set an example in purity. Purity goes way beyond outward appearances. Have you ever seen someone that looks like they've got everything together? They look like they've got the world by the tail. They're in command of everything. Well, Isaiah writes in Isaiah 29 and 13, he talks about people there that honor God with their lips, but their hearts are a long ways off from God. And true purity starts with a heart that has been transformed by the Holy Spirit. Young people, we have no room for impurity in our lives. No room at all. Right now, I have a bottle of water up here. I have a bottle of water. And I just opened this up while we were singing, and I trust that this water is pure. I trust that this water is clean. When you look at it, it looks clear. It looks like there's no impurity in it. I hope that it's safe. But here's the thing. There can be little bitty things that get in this water that, even though the water looks good, it can still have impurities in it. And the thing is that so many people, so many Christians go through their lives and they try to live their life in a manner that looks clean, but they might harbor just a little bit of impurity here and there in their life. They try to hide things and put things in rooms. Have you ever, I don't know if you guys have ever done this before, but whenever it comes time to clean a room, my boys will take everything that's in their room and shove it into a closet. And when you go and open the door to the closet, it's like an avalanche falls out on you. We do that with our lives. We try to take things and we cram it into a certain place and hide it from the rest of the world. But we know that there is still a closet full of sin in our life. There's still something hidden away, but you can't see it to the eye. But it's still there. And Paul tells Timothy, he says, look, Timothy, you can't have the appearance of purity. You can't have just the appearance, but you have to be the test case for purity. You have to be the one that sets the example. Your life has to be a life that is set apart and consecrated totally and wholly to God. A life that's devoted, a life that can't be swayed. You should be an example. So, Haram, if you'll come back, buddy, just play softly. Here's my challenge this morning, and I wish that all the young people would listen up for just a moment. I'm going to give you older folks a challenge too, okay? But I want all of you to listen to me. Young people, kids, teenagers, you are never too young to be used by God. You are never too young to be used by God. Abigail, do you know that God can use you? He can. Grace, God can use you, babe. Liam, God can use you, buddy. You know, like David was a young man. He was truly a young man. He had a heart that was on fire. passionate for his God, full of zeal for the Lord. And what I would challenge you young people is let your love for Jesus shine bright. Shine brightly. Be the example and the inspiration to those around you. So that's to the kids, but to you that are not kids, here's my challenge to you. If you go way back in the New Testament, there's this little bitty book called Titus. And in Titus, I believe Paul was the author. In Titus, he lays out what the responsibilities and what the duties are of those that are more seasoned in the faith. There is an obligation and a duty that has been handed to you to raise up, to train, to love, to disciple. The word that's out there now that so many people use is mentor. That's actually what was going on. The Apostle Paul tells them, you older men and you older ladies, you need to be a mentor for the younger generation. Teach them how to grow up to be godly men and women. Teach them how to function in their homes. Teach them how to be godly people in their vocations. Teach them. So that's my challenge to you, that you find somebody in here and you mentor them, love them, encourage them,